President, I rise this afternoon to speak about a matter that will come before the Senate tomorrow when the Senate votes on whether or not to invoke cloture on the Customs and Trade Enforcement Conference report. Last year, Mr. President, Democrats and Republicans in both chambers of the Congress came together and said it was time for a fresh policy on international trade, a fresh, modern policy that I describe as trade done right. At the heart of trade done right is a tougher, smarter plan to fight the trade cheats who are ripping off American jobs. Now, the inventiveness of these rip-off artists takes your breath away, and it's something I know a fair amount about because a few years back, as chairman of the Trade Subcommittee, we put together a sting operation and in effect invited those rip-off artists from around the world to cheat, and we were just flooded with those who were interested in skirting the laws. They have extraordinarily inventive ways of moving their operations, concealing their identities, and shipping their products into our country through shadowy, untraceable routes, sometimes sneaking illegal imports into this country is as simple as slapping a new label on a box. We call it merchandise laundering. And we saw it again and again and again as we conducted this sting operation. So it is long past time to come up with a new and tough approach to enforcing our trade laws. And that, in my view, is what this debate's about. And that's what the vote will be about tomorrow. Now, the lingo of trade policy, as we call it, TPA, the Trade Promotion Authority, what are the rules for trade, and then the various agreements, what of course is being considered now, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's hard to keep track of this lingo under the best of circumstances. So I think in beginning this discussion, what I want to note for the Senate is this is not about the consideration of a new trade agreement. No trade agreement, no new trade agreement is going to be considered by the United States Senate this week. What this debate is about is whether or not the Senate is going to put in place tougher, smarter, more modern trade enforcement policies, and when we have these policies, actually follow up on them and stand up to anybody around the world who is trying to figure out a way to get around them. And my view is tough, smart trade enforcement ought to be a priority for every senator, no matter how they choose to vote on a particular new trade agreement. My bottom line here is that past trade policies were too old, too slow, or too weak to keep up with the trade cheats. But that's what this legislation is going to change. This legislation says those days are over. And I'd like to take just a few minutes to describe why I believe, Mr. President, this package we will vote on is the strongest set of trade enforcement policies that the Congress has considered in decades. At its core, what trade law enforcement is all about is rooting out the universe of scofflaw tactics that the cheats rely on. They use fraudulent records and shell games and sophisticated schemes to evade duties and undercut our American producers. Foreign governments bully American business into relocating factories and jobs or turning over lucrative intellectual property. They spy on American companies and trade enforcers, steal secrets, and then they lie about it in the aftermath. And they try to undercut American industries so quickly that our nation has been unable to act before the economic damage is done. With the vote that we are going to cast this week, we have an opportunity to say strongly and loudly that we are done sitting back and just watching our companies get their clock cleaned by trade cheats. This country is going to take trade enforcement to a new level to protect workers and businesses in Oregon and nationwide. My view is the center of this effort is the Enforce Act, which goes after what I consider to be one of the biggest of the trade loopholes, and that is merchandise laundering. This is a proposal, Mr. President, that a number of senators have worked for years to get enacted. What it will do is put a stop to the evasion of duties that are put in place to protect our workers, protect our manufacturers, and particularly when it comes to the steel industry, a pillar of American industry, and the Enforce Act ought to be understood to be clearly a priority matter for those who work in the steel industry and the companies that they work at. Second, the legislation once and for all closes a truly offensive loophole that allowed products made with slave and child labor to be imported to the United States. My friend, Senator Brown, has championed this issue. He and I believe that in 2016 and beyond, the Congress cannot allow for the perpetrators of slave or child labor to have any place in the American economy. So the old system that leaves the door open to child or slave labor if it's used to make a product that isn't made here in the United States, that system has to end, and with this legislation, it will. Mr. President, the old system essentially said that when it came to child labor, in the past, economics would trump human rights. That economics just mattered more than protecting vulnerable children. And Senator Brown said, no way. That is a grotesque set of priorities. And we closed that loophole. Closed once and for all. Another major upgrade in this trade package is what I call an unfair trade alert. I have heard for years and years from union leaders, from companies and others, that the trade cheats often try to exploit the fact that trade law enforcement moves along at a snail's pace. What happens is the rip-off artists break the rules. They hope the damage is going to be done before anybody in Washington catches on. That way, the factory lights go out at the plant, and the plant is shuttered before our country does anything about it. What we have done with this new unfair trade alert system is ensured that there are going to be warning bells going off long before the damage is done. Next, the package includes an important initiative from Senator Stabenow to mobilize the institutions of government into a permanent, ongoing trade enforcement center so that we have all hands on deck to fight the trade cheats. And with Senator Stabenow's proposal, we're going to make sure that when it comes to fighting the trade cheats, the left hand and the right hand are working in concert. The package creates a new trust fund for trade enforcement. This was developed by Senator Cantwell to drive America's investment in fresh ideas and do it in a way that will help protect our workers and our businesses. The proposal also ensures that small businesses and their employees are going to be able to find an easier path into the winner's circle on international trade. It's going to lower the cost for a lot of small businesses in Oregon and nationwide that import products to our country. In my home state, this effort, led by Senator Shaheen, who has done great work on the Small Business Committee, this effort is hugely important because in my state, when you're done counting a handful of big businesses, you've covered the big employers in our state. We are overwhelmingly about small business. And because of the good work of Senator Shaheen, we are going to give small businesses more tools they can use to reach new markets overseas. And it's going to help guarantee that all our trade agencies are looking for opportunities to help small businesses grow. And Mr. President, I could go on with others. I think Senator Feinstein has done very, very important work. For example, we've been looking for a model for trade-based humanitarian assistance. I think Senator Feinstein's contribution has helped us secure that goal, and I appreciate greatly her leadership. Now, when it comes to trade policies, environmental protections are a special priority for me and for Oregonians, and I believe for the American people. So I want one judgment about this bill to be very clear as we start this debate. This legislation cannot and will not in any way prevent the United States from negotiating a climate agreement. Not only that, the package tackles some particularly important environmental issues head on. It directs our trade negotiators to act against illegal fishing and fishing subsidies that destroy our oceans. And it's going to help guarantee that the customs personnel are better trained to fight the trade of stolen timber from places like the Amazon. These are big improvements over the old playbook of trade enforcement. Now, many senators, both sides of the aisle, are very concerned about currency manipulation. In the process of bringing this bipartisan, bicameral package together, it was clear that there were some differences between the Senate and the other body on this legislation, and that the other body was willing to go only so far on currency questions. When senators vote, and I know currency is important to them, I hope that they will reflect on the view that I'm going to articulate, and that is this legislation goes further than ever before to fight the currency manipulators. And one of the major reasons it does it is because of our colleague, Senator Bennett. Senator Bennett has been working with all sides diligently on this issue, and I think he has clearly given us a policy that we can build on in the years and days ahead. I intend to work with Senator Bennett and all of our colleagues on both sides of the aisle at every opportunity to head off the currency manipulators, stop them from undercutting American jobs and American businesses, and there is no question in my mind that this legislation goes significantly further than ever before to fight currency abuse and manipulation. Now, it's been my judgment for years that a more progressive approach to trade and stronger trade enforcement are two sides of the same coin. Last year, the Senate said loudly and clearly that future trade deals have to raise the bar for American priorities such as labor rights, environmental protection. And because of Senator Cardin, we will now have a new focus on human rights. Now the Senate has an opportunity to stand up for workers and businesses in Oregon and across the country by kicking the enforcement of trade law into high gear. My view is that this landmark trade enforcement proposal ought to have strong bipartisan support. Also included in the conference report, Mr. President, is a permanent extension of one of the most popular economic policies on the books today, the Internet Tax Freedom Act. Former Congressman Chris Cox and I introduced this bill back in 1998, and for nearly 2 decades, Mr. President, what this legislation did is it protected working families, especially against regressive taxes on internet access. That was who we always thought was the focus of this bill. Working families, families that use the net, for example, to get information about employment opportunities, educational opportunities, they shouldn't face a wave of new regressive, taxes. And clearly, ensuring that they don't get hit by these regressive taxes has saved our working families and our small businesses hundreds of dollars a year. But for all that time, this has been a kind of temporary stop-and-go policy that required it just be renewed again and again and again and again. So my hope is, as senators look at a bill that, in my view, is the toughest trade enforcement law in decades and really moves to a very new approach that I call trade done right. I hope senators will see that this legislation also ensures that working families and senior citizens and others of modest means don't get hit by this big regressive tax simply when they want to access, the internet. Access the internet for the kind of information so important to them, given a modest income and their desire to get ahead. And with this legislation and its extension running out this year, it's important for the Senate to act now so that you don't have a situation again at the end of the year with the prospect of the Internet Tax Freedom Act expiring and working families getting hit with these regressive taxes. So I urge senators to support this proposal. There's been an awful lot of work done by senators on both sides of the aisle to advance this legislation. I'm particularly grateful to our colleagues on the Finance Committee that I have the honor to serve on. And I close simply by saying to colleagues, this is not about a new trade agreement. It's not exactly an atomic secret. There are pretty strong differences of opinion about new trade agreements here in this body. This is about whether we're going to get tough with the trade cheats who are ripping off American jobs. And this legislation gives us the opportunity to do it, and I urge its support, and I yield back.